Thank you, everybody, for participating today. Justin Trottier is founder and National Executive Director for the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, a hub of health and social services for boys, men, fathers, and families. After building facilities in Toronto, Ottawa, St. Thomas, and Calgary, he led the initiative, which is on track to open the first emergency family shelter for abused fathers and children this coming April. Previously, Justin played a leadership role in a variety of humanist and secular organizations, in particular the Centre for Inquiry Canada, where he served as executive director for 7 years. Justin is also a passionate advocate for public science education and hosts The Star Spot, which is an astronomy-based themed radio show and podcast. Today, Justin will take us through the emotional journey that men may experience with a cancer diagnosis in their lives, and will give us some thoughtful information to best support men in our lives as they walk through their anxiety and grief. So Justin, just thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be with us today and to do this presentation. And it's all yours now.
Well, thanks to both of you for the introduction, and to you both and Tracy for the kind invitation to have me present. I think the first thing I should probably do is just lower expectations by explaining that I am not a grief counselor or an expert necessarily on this particular subject, but what I do, having founded the Center for Men and Families, is on a daily basis interact with boys, men, fathers, and their families. And these are men who are often in crisis or in distress and experiencing a broad range of emotional responses, and seeing how they reflect on that, how they react to that, and then building programs and services that are responsive in a positive and healthy way to assist them through that crisis. So this is more informed by those experiences, both personally and professionally, rather than my claim to having professional research background in this particular area, but I have done quite a bit of research in preparation for this presentation, and then also reflecting on those experiences that I've seen. So having lowered your expectations, I'll try to do as best a job as I can to go through some of this material. What I did want to say, and I'll get back to this a little later, is just the irony of life. Last week, I actually experienced the loss of a close friend, a close family friend. So I've been going through the personal kind of aftermath of that, and then also looking at analyzing my own responses from a gender lens, and as we'll see, other kinds of factors that play into how each of us as individuals respond to loss or other forms of grief that we may be experiencing. And I'll reflect a little bit on that a little bit later, but I thought, geez, what an ironic coincidence of timing that should happen just as I'm preparing for this presentation, but that is life. Okay, so just before, well, that was the introduction. Before I get into the gender side of things, I did want to go through the styles of grief, and this does come out of the literature, and in particular research by Kenneth Doka and Terry Martin, who may be familiar to a number of you. As you'll see, this does relate to gender, but it's bigger than that. There are three generally understood styles of grieving. One is known as instrumental, and this is to experience grief in more physical or cognitive ways, an interest in seeking out accurate information, analyzing facts, making informed decisions, and then taking action to solve problems. So it's very much an action-oriented, problem-solving kind of approach. It does have the drawback that people might see an individual grieving in this way as being more detached, more cold. And as we'll see, this is kind of the classic stereotypical male response. Although we'll also see that it's not always true, it's just kind of a generality. The other style is known as intuitive grieving, and this is more experienced as waves of emotion, experiencing the full range of emotional responses, being more sensitive to one's own and others' feelings of grief, concurrently less able potentially to rationalize or intellectualize because one is so caught up in that emotional response. And that can appear to be somebody who's devastated or overwhelmed by grief. And again, this is stereotypically more associated with a female response, but it is just as much a generalization as the male response would be. Now, the third one here that researchers have found, they call dissonant mourning, and that's where there's a conflict between the internal experience, what you feel inside, and then your outward expression of mourning. And that can be because of cultural expectations, gender expectations that might create that kind of disconnect. And we'll see that can affect a lot of men who are brought up and taught to experience grief in a certain way, but they may feel inside very emotional and like they want to express themselves emotionally, but they just can't find the language to communicate that. There are a few caveats. I've already sort of hinted at them. One is that these are generalizations, and we should really think of grief as existing on a continuum with instrumental, with the two different styles I was just describing, the intuitive and the instrumental, occupying different ends of that continuum, as opposed to people falling into one or the other as though they were polar opposite binaries, when it really is, again, more of a continuum. The other thing is, in addition to gender differences, which are real, we also have personality traits, which are unique to each of us. We have sociocultural factors, which we'll get into, things like educational level, cultural background, race and ethnicity, which can sometimes play just as big or even a bigger role in how individuals experience grief as gender differences might. And then the other important caveat is, and I've already mentioned this one as well, we should not confuse the outward expression of mourning to the inward feeling of grief. Just because somebody is or is not emotionally overwhelmed in how they project themselves doesn't mean they're not feeling things very strongly. And that is sometimes, I think, an issue for how we perceive men who seem to be more detached, that might not actually indicate that they're not feeling strong pain inside. Just a little bit about the male role based on some of the research in this area. And this is just connecting sort of gender or sociological research to this issue of grief. And one has to do with the messages that we send to men, teaching men to be strong or stoic, to be emotionally controlled, to be less emotionally less interested in emotional self-care, and to seek out solitude and action as opposed to expressions of strong emotion. Relatedly, how we socialize men, and again, this is changing, this is generalizing, but there's still some truth to this, and that is that we do tend to raise boys and girls with different messages about what it means to play a role as a man or as a woman. And there is some research that shows that, for example, a crying or screaming boy or young infant male, I should say, a parent is more likely to take a little bit longer to pick up or soothe a male infant than a female one. So this starts very early on. I'm borrowing here from some research by psychologist Judith Stillian, who summarizes the male role or roles in these 4 ways. And the first is what she calls the stiff upper lip syndrome, which I think we know what that is. And that's, again, being taught to be strong and stoical in the face of difficult and challenging situations. The second one is the powerful loner stereotype. And again, that's withdrawing or isolating as opposed to seeking out support and connections. The third one is protector and provider. This is still very much with us, and that's the expectation on men to be a breadwinner for the family. And sometimes that means men gravitate to more dangerous jobs or longer hours at work, because those tend to pay better. The fourth one is being fearless. So whether it's true or it's just the way the man projects himself, he's not expected to show fear in the face of challenges. And again, this is changing quite thankfully, but these modes are still with us. We still need to encounter them and deal with them as we process grief. So just in terms of putting side by side how men and women grieve in generalities, this is kind of more or less summarizing what I've already been talking about, but men being more internal in terms of seeking, of avoiding connections and being more focused on finding strength inside themselves. Avoiding talking about the experience is sometimes how that manifests itself. Also feeling a sense of failure, because again, if you're supposed to be this fearless protector and now you're potentially suffering a loss of, let's say, a child or something tragic like that, then it can feel as though that was personally your fault. And there's that sense of failure that can exacerbate feelings of guilt and grief. There's also a desire sometimes to move forward, to take on new projects, to get back to work very quickly, sometimes as a distraction, and that might be unhealthy, but sometimes that's a part of a healthy, positive coping to kind of get things moving again in one's life. And then an avoidance of professional support resources. And sometimes that's because it's what men have been taught often it is because resources are not, we'll get into this a little bit, necessarily as male friendly, as male positive as they might be, and that can send the signal that support services are not available to men, not welcoming to men. That too is changing, but there's still work to be done. And women, on the other hand, tend to be more open with expressions of feeling, looking for those connections with others, sometimes feeling frustrated if others, say the man or men in her life, are not as open with or willing to share their grief. That might create a bridge between her and him. And then also women tend to be more interested in professional social supports as well, support groups, grief counselors, those sorts of things. And I should say I'm getting quite a bit of this in this case of this particular slide from the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, which has some great resources on their website. Now, the primary message here, though, is there's no wrong way to grieve. In general, these strategies are not better or worse. They're just different ways of handling grief. But I do want to quote from a psychologist named Tom Golden, because what can happen is that we perceive the male styles of grieving as inappropriate, as men kind of hiding their true feelings, and as therefore not truly grieving. And here's what Tom Golden says: the masculine side of healing is often not as accepted a mode as the more traditional verbal and emotional expression. It tends to be quieter and less visible, less connected with the past and more with the future, less connected with passivity and more aligned with action. And as a consequence, he goes on to state, I've noticed repeatedly that people who use a predominance of this, quote, masculine side of healing are suspected, even by mental health professionals, of not really healing. So the point is to accept these male styles, that for the most part, they're positive, they're effective, and then to build on them, to work within them. And there are some strategies that I'll get into as we go through this for how one might do that. So this is, again, reiterating common symptoms of grief in men. I think I will just kind of pass this on quickly because I think we've touched on these for the most part. I will note maybe a couple of these that I haven't touched on. So anger and irritability. Well, this anger is one of the few emotional states permitted to men in terms of how men still tend to be socialized. And so often when men are feeling other emotions, whether it's sadness or other strong negative emotions, they may in turn turn to anger as the one kind of familiar or comforting emotion that they have. And anger isn't necessarily a bad state to be. It depends how you use your anger. But if it's bottled up and if it's the man acts out in ways that are harmful to themselves or others, then this is something to be concerned about, of course. And we want to try to channel that anger and frustration in positive ways. And one way to do that is to encourage the man to use that anger or that frustration to get the help that they need, to understand the anger is telling them that they do need to get support. The one at the bottom, though, substance abuse, is something to be concerned about. In my organization in particular, we have some addiction recovery services that try to be positive with respect to men, try to understand what leads men to engage in alcohol or substance abuse, and kind of connect the dots between this kind of classic way for men to deal with their problems and what the underlying issues truly are. So we do need to be aware of some of these more unhelpful ways of healing or of grieving, but also where there's, as I said, positive male strategies, kind of build on those, reinforce those. Okay, so I think I have talked about most of the things on this slide. The action-oriented approaches that men take. The need to take control is sort of related to that, and it does go back to men as protector and provider. This is a way for men to sort of reassert that role by taking charge of family issues. Working more is related to withdrawing, however, and sometimes the work is not a bad thing. We do need distractions every now and then, but if it turns into workaholism, then that's something to be concerned about. The isolation, I think I've referred to in previous slides. The last one here, I'll get back to again a little bit later. This is treating the loss or treating the cause of the grief as a problem to solve. It's not always a bad thing. In fact, it can often lead men to get involved in political advocacy or in legal reform efforts and things of that kind, which in fact is one way in which men who come through the services we provide at Center for Men and Families end up in turn getting involved in some of the political advocacy work that we do to try to make the system more just for all members. And so there's a a positive harnessing of one's anger and frustration in this way that one can do good or make changes in our community. Now, I did want to speak, though, to some of the consequences of repressed grief. And as I say, not everything is always positive in terms of how men deal with grief. There is, as I said earlier, the potential for substance abuse, the potential for workaholism. There are also consequences on a man's mental health, or on anybody's mental health, if one isn't able to express grief in positive and healthy ways, and doesn't get the support that you need. And these are things like chronic depression, self-esteem, potentially a relationship breakdown. And again, there may be that disconnect between how a man and a woman experience grief and mourning, and that can create conflict within a relationship if it's not worked through in a healthy way. Somatic effects such as headaches, fatigue, backaches, and that sort of thing. And we've covered the last two items on the list. So what can men do to help themselves when they're grieving? Well, one thing I like to talk about is if men are interested in remaining strong and showing strength and being stoical, understanding that the experience of painful emotions and surviving through them and getting help for them is actually a form of strength. So teaching men to reimagine what strength is as not avoiding pain, but actually as experiencing it fully, and yet surviving through it, getting the support, if not for oneself, then for loved ones and family members. Maintaining communications as best as possible with loved ones, even if it's just being in the same room and not withdrawing. It doesn't have to be talking about the issue over and over again, but it just means being present with loved ones and taking time to do joint activities with them. Connecting with the outside world for a lot of men, engaging in physical activity, getting out of the house, going for walks, gardening, all those things can be helpful as well, exercising. And then, bread and butter, self-care, sleeping, eating well, avoiding drugs and alcohol. What others can do in support of male loved ones who are grieving? Well, it's sort of the converse of what the man himself would do. So to be there for him, to reward and support any positive communications on his part by being a safe place for him to seek out support on his own terms, making suggestions for professional services if he's willing to engage in grief counseling or support groups. I would say male-led support groups are often useful for men. Those tend to be more psychoeducational in orientation. So providing information, providing resources, as well as being a source of emotional support. Maintaining usual patterns of contact, and checking in with men on a regular basis, but not overdoing it, giving men space and time. And again, as I say, on their own terms, letting them come to you, but just for them to know that you are available as needed to support them. The last thing on this list is kind of interesting. This is a fairly new concept, kind of called cheekily health by stealth, which is engaging men in terms of their mental health, but doing it in a way that's not directly about health. And Movember, which probably a lot of you are familiar with, the Movember agency, has pioneered this. It's called Men's Sheds. The original concept came out of Australia. The idea originally was setting up actual sheds. They're not necessarily sheds anymore, but the original idea was often in a garage, to get men together to tinker and fix things and build things, and often build things for the community. But then in the course of doing these very traditional or stereotypical male activities, engaging men in discussions around their health. And surprisingly, the research shows that this has been a very effective way to get men to open up. Our agency and a number of other men's support agencies are looking at bringing this to Canada and kind of expanding the model a little bit to find other ways of engaging men where they are, engaging them where they're comfortable, and using that as a way of opening up these men's health kind of discussions. I wanted to just pause here and talk a little bit about some examples in my own life personally, but also professionally, seeing men as I do on a daily basis at the Center for Men and Families. But I'll start by being a little bit open about my own recent experiences. I mentioned the tragic death of a loved one in my family. I did have the opportunity to sort of examine my own responses and that of some of the people that I've interacted with who knew this individual. And, not surprisingly, there were some conforming to gender stereotypes, but also some differences as well. I found, for example, the individual who died is a young woman, quite tragically, and her husband really took a very kind of action-oriented approach. Even when asked how he was coping, his response was often to give us a narration of his day. So all the things that he was doing, how much time he had spent, for example, looking for the dress of the individual who had died as they prepared for her funeral. So it was always very matter of fact. Here's what I have had to do and the phone calls I've had to make and things like that. Very stoic. Although after enough conversations of that kind, he did occasionally break down more emotionally with us on the phone. My response was actually one of anger. The person who died had suffered from various mental health issues. And my feeling was, damn it, why wasn't anybody able to do a better job at keeping her alive? Even why wasn't she able to find the resources she needed? So a little bit of misplaced anger, but found that interesting that my own response was one of frustration and anger. My wife, who knew her better than I did, and they were very close friends, much more expressive emotionally with her response, albeit, she was closer, of course, to the individual who passed away. But interestingly, she was engaging a little bit in problem solving and in seeing it as a bit of a puzzle. Why did this happen when it did? This was a young woman who seemed, generally speaking, like in fairly good health. So why did this happen? And kind of going through a timeline of events leading up to her death to try to piece together the circumstances leading up to the tragedy, which I guess is more of a problem solving kind of quote unquote masculine approach. So I guess the point is, it's that people don't fit into those stereotypes all the time. I want to talk a little bit about some of the experiences I've seen from clients here at the Center for Men and Families, and all of these are very sad and tragic circumstances. They're hard just to even talk about. One of our clients had a son who took his life as a teenager, which losing a child is obviously the worst thing you can imagine. His response was one of depression, anger. He sort of threw himself into work, looked for a new career. He was sort of between jobs when this happened. So his way of coping was largely to reabsorb himself in his professional life. We had a man who lost access to his children. One of the things we deal with as a fathering organization is what happens in family court. And without getting the politics of it, very often after a separation or divorce, a father will have very little access, if any access at all, with his children. And one of our clients went through that and almost took his life because it was such a loss to him to imagine he would never see his child again. And thankfully, after a number of years, he did reestablish contact, but he went 3 or 4 years without having really any contact with his child. And it drew him to our agency. He became an advocate. And that is one way men cope, as I say, is they seek to get involved in political advocacy or legal reform to change aspects of the system, which might have had something to do with their loss. And that certainly brought quite a few men out to our line of work, such as it is. In my sort of last portion of this presentation, wanted to speak a little bit more specifically about male responses to a cancer diagnosis, given the focus of the Wellspring Agency. But I thought I should sort of conclude with that. So here you do see, again, the sort of stereotypical male response, the detached, quiet, action-oriented approach. But I did want to just quote here, actually, from some interesting research, which gives us pause, lets us know that these generalizations do have limits. This is from a 2017 article, so just a few years ago, called Does Gender Matter?, which appeared in Social Science and Medicine. And you can see the quote there in front of you. In accounting for their responses to symptoms, they found that men and women drew equally on culturally embedded moral framework of stoicism and responsible service use, regardless of gender. The accounts portrayed participants as stoic in response to illness and responsible in how they used services, and they were talking mostly about medical services here. And so what they found was, at least this research, but it was borne out by related research as well, is that men and women actually were more similar than they were different in terms of how they responded to a diagnosis. In this case, it was specifically lung cancer. I also wanted to talk about intersectionality in responding to a cancer diagnosis, because sometimes other factors can be more important than gender. And I'm talking here about the intersection of gender with things like racial differences, ethnic differences. So I point to one piece of research looking at how much of a factor race and ethnicity plays in patient-reported outcomes, in that case of prostate cancer diagnosis. Education, it was found that lower levels of education correlated to worse outcomes, including mental health outcomes, post, in this case, prostate cancer, a diagnosis again. So you can read the literature there for yourself. There is some very interesting scholarly work being done in understanding what are the different factors, not just gender, but some of these others, in accounting for how people cope and their outcomes post-diagnosis. But here are some coping strategies that men do find to be of assistance to them. And these are going to be related or similar to the ones you've already heard me speak of about grief more generally. One is psychoeducational approaches, again, a combination of seeking out facts and education and resources, as well as the mutual support that a psychoeducational support group can provide, often both of those things. Developing a plan of action, again, that goes back to the action activity kind of related focus for a lot of men in dealing with grief of various kinds. So helping men to put together that plan of action is something that caregivers and loved ones can play a role in doing that. Setting priorities. A diagnosis is going to affect your life in short-term and long-term ways. So it's a good time to take stock, provide a unique or new sort of perspective on life, and resetting your priorities. Identifying sources of support, whether that is traditional kind of professional sources of psychosocial support, or whether that's reconnecting with family and friends, if that is a more comfortable way to get that support. Engaging in self-care, again, eating well, sleeping well, going for walks, meditating, those sorts of things. And writing down your thoughts has been found to be a positive way for both men and women to cope with a diagnosis or other forms of grief. How others can help men. Well, again, being there for them is the key thing. Making yourself available to attend medical appointments or support groups, if the groups are open to loved ones attending. Learning about the diagnosis, just as the man is doing that, to be equally informed. And then again, being there for him. So supporting him with what he needs, not telling him what he should need, but whatever coping strategies he's using, playing into that, reinforcing that if they're positive coping strategies, and helping him to get the resources that he needs based on what he communicates to you. And then engaging in your own self-care, because of course, supporting a loved one through cancer diagnosis or in any form of grieving process is going to take a toll on the caregiver as well. So making sure that you're taking care of yourself just as you're encouraging him to do likewise. Positive interventions, providing individualized approaches. Every man is different, as every woman is, in dealing with a diagnosis. So in addition to support groups that bring lots of people together, making sure that there is an individual plan of action for that individual. Training men in how to communicate more effectively. A lot of men, I think, these days want to communicate, but maybe because of the way they were socialized, they've not had as much experience or as much familiarity with how to communicate positively. It may be one reason they turn to strong negative emotions, anger and frustration to in lieu of being able to communicate sadness. So teaching them those sorts of positive communication tools is a role that caregivers can play. Assisting men in building and broadening social support networks. Research tells us that men tend to have smaller social networks than women. When asked who their best friend is, a man is more likely to say my significant other than a woman is. And so if a man is open to it, helping him find ways of engaging and broadening his social network is a great role for a loved one. Building support groups for men, those psychoeducational support groups and mutual support groups I was referring to, often peer-led, male-led, are more effective. And male positive support agencies. And I mentioned I'd get back to this. So this is one of the things our agency tries to do in terms of not only providing in-house support to men, but also working across the social service sector with other agencies like Wellspring, for example, is a really good example of that, to do webinars and training like we're doing today, and engaging in partnership building to work together to better support men. And that's often just through messaging and branding and marketing, and making sure that the language we use in encouraging men to seek out services is male friendly. Very often agencies mean well, but you look at the marketing that they use and the photos are all of exclusively female service users, and men see that, they pick up on that, whether consciously or unconsciously, and it gives a message that, okay, this agency is really for women, even if they're trying to be gender inclusive. The signals that they're sending are more geared towards women. So there are actually little things that agencies can do to make it clear that they're open to men, which don't involve a lot of cost, don't involve sort of changing their mandate, but just being a little bit more sensitive, I think, to those cues that men may be picking up on. And that's the end of the presentation. So thank you. I hope you learned something from that. I hope that was of some benefit, and I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Justin, for that presentation. I think it was very informative.